How'd the meeting go, sir?
Meeting went very well. Was with him for about an hour. He basically walked us around the world, showed a great grasp of a variety of the challenges that are out there and some of the opportunities as well. So, very good conversation, and we'll see where it goes from here.
There is General David Petraeus after meeting with President-elect Trump this week in New York. They toured the world. General Petraeus comes to us from Germany this morning. Thank you for joining us, General Petraeus. And you heard Vice President-elect Mike Pence speaking about your service to this country and calling you an American hero. Talked about your possibility of getting confirmed as well. It appears that that is not disqualifying, that your security clearance problems are not disqualifying to President-elect Trump right now, but CNN has reported that several Republican senators are concerned about this confirmation battle. One said it's causing a high level of angst. What can you say to reassure them?
Well, first of all, Guten Tag, George. Good to be with you. What I would say to them is what I've acknowledged for a number of years. 5 years ago, I made a serious mistake. I acknowledged it. I apologized for it. I paid a very heavy price for it, and I've learned from it. And again, they'll have to factor that in, and also obviously 38 and a half years of otherwise fairly, in some cases, unique service to our country in uniform and at the CIA, and then some 4 years or so in the business community, during which I've continued to travel the world, nearly 40 countries in that time as well.
You'll be pressed on whether you made false statements to the FBI. Director Comey said you did, and you acknowledged that in your plea agreement, yet your attorney told the Washington Post this week that you simply forgot about the journal. So are you challenging the director's conclusion there?
Well, no. Look, I mean, obviously, I made a false statement. At the time, I didn't think it was false, and frankly, I think if they had, they might have pursued that more. I'd also like to add, by the way, something that he left out, which is that the FBI in the agreement acknowledged that nothing that was in my journals that I shared, certainly improperly, ended up in the biography or made it out to the public. I think that's a fairly significant point. In fact, the book was read by someone, a colonel at the time, Mike Meese, who'd been with me in the whole year that I was in Afghanistan, is now a brigadier general retired. But again, look, I made a mistake. I have again acknowledged it. Folks will have to factor that in and determine whether that is indeed disqualifying or not.
What was your impression of President-elect Trump? You've worked with several presidents. How does he stack up?
Well, I think he's actually quite pragmatic. In our conversation, what I enjoyed most, frankly, was the discussion of issues, or let's say campaign rhetoric, if you will, and then placing that in a strategic context. As an example, he's not anti-trade, he's anti-unfair trade. The wall, well, the wall would be an element in a comprehensive effort to shore up our security on the southern border, which, by the way, as we discussed, would include more help to Mexico for the problems that it has in the broader rule of law area, and indeed perhaps with its southern border, which is so challenged as well. But again, we talked about all of those kinds of issues. These are issues in which I have concern, needless to say, and it was good to discuss the strategic context in which each of those would be placed.
If you were chosen as Secretary of State, you'd have the job of convincing Mexico to pay for that wall. How would you do it?
Well, I'm not sure what the scheme would be there for that. Again, the issue with Mexico would be to determine together how we could improve the status of the security while certainly not impeding the flow of commerce back and forth that is so very important to both of our countries. Indeed, it's notable that the president-elect has already gained agreement from President Peña and I believe with the Canadian Prime Minister as well to sit down to examine issues in NAFTA. You may recall that together with Bob Zoellick, former World Bank president, I co-chaired a Council on Foreign Relations task force on North America that identified a number of pages of issues that could be resolved on NAFTA to make it even more effective for the citizens of all three of our nations.
One of the things you called for in that report was comprehensive immigration reform, which it doesn't appear that President-elect Trump is interested in that. And you certainly didn't mention anything about Mexico paying for a wall on our border.
Well, I think actually immigration issues will be among those that will be addressed. There will be a number of initiatives, I would think, based on the discussions during the campaign and in our meeting about how to ensure that we are very carefully reviewing those who come to our country, particularly those in immigration, also shoring up our defenses just but on those who come here on passports for tourism.
And I want to move on to Russia now. President Putin of Russia is giving an interview overnight where he called President-elect Trump a smart man. President-elect Trump has praised him as well. But one of the other contenders, Secretary of State Mitt Romney, famously called Russia under Putin our top strategic threat. Who's right about that, President-elect Trump or Mitt Romney?
Well, Russia certainly is one of the threats, one of the challenges to our security and that of our allies and partners around the world. But it's also a feature of the landscape. There are issues in which we do have convergences, and I don't think you would rule out at all discussions at some point in time with Russia about issues such as the defeat of the Islamic State, such as the ultimate resolution in Syria, obviously about the challenges of the Russian-supported separatists in southeastern Ukraine. Again, you can keep going around the world, and again, strategic discussion, I think, is very much warranted with Russia and indeed with China, as well as our allies and partners around the world.
Is a meeting of the minds possible with Russia on Syria? When you were in the government, you were advocating arming and supporting the Syrian rebels. President-elect Trump doesn't seem all that interested in that, and Russia has been decimating them in recent weeks.
Well, look, let's first of all focus on the defeat of Daesh, of the Islamic State, and indeed of the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. In some cases, that is going to be pursued in support of some of the opposition forces that are on the ground in Syria. That is the primary vehicle that we have on the ground, and is what is being enabled by our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and strike assets overhead. The ultimate resolution of Syria inevitably is going to involve all of the different regional stakeholders, the Sunni opposition forces, the Syrian Kurds, and indeed the regime forces that are being supported by Russia. And ultimately, discussions with Russia, continuing what Secretary Kerry has been doing, will be necessary, although I think you probably have got to take a very cold, hard look at the situation and ask whether the discussion, what is being sought now in diplomacy, is actually realistic or not. But that time will come some months from now. Speaking
about what's realistic or not, President-elect Trump has vowed to rip up the Iran deal when he becomes president. If you were Secretary of State, would you advise him to do that? Is it even possible?
Well, first of all, we discussed this, and I think the issue here is to ask, what is it that we really want to see happen in this case? And I think that the two overriding objectives are to ensure that Iran lives up to its word, that it doesn't ever seek to have a nuclear weapon, and you could do that by the White House and Congress having a statement of national purpose that Iran will never be allowed to enrich uranium to weapons grade, and then ensure that U.S. Central Command, which I was privileged to command, as you'll recall, maintains the capability to carry out the contingency plans that we developed back in that time as well. And then the other big objective is to counter the malign Iranian activity in the region, its activities in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere, working with our regional partners and our ally Israel in so doing.
But our allies aren't going to go along with ripping up the Iran deal, are they?
Well, again, multilateral deal, have to sit down and really assess. This is a deal I've publicly said has some positive elements to it. It's also got some significantly negative elements, including that it ends 10 to 15 years, depending on the various elements of the agreement, with no clear indication of what follows it. So again, coming back to what our overriding strategic objectives are, then assessing whether this deal should be ripped up or not as part of achieving those objectives is, I think, going to be the task of the administration when it takes office in January.
One of the other questions you might face, if indeed you are chosen by President-elect Trump to be Secretary of State, is how to handle the fact that if you're chosen, you'll have three former generals in the top national security positions. General Flynn is National Security Advisor, General Mattis at the Pentagon as well. What would you say to senators or Americans who are concerned about the over-reliance on the military in those spots?
Well, general is not necessarily a general. I'm not trying to sound insufficiently humble here, but I would contend that I carried out about as much statesmanship working as the commander of a theater of war in Iraq, together with the great diplomat Ryan Crocker, in Afghanistan with a number of different coalition ambassadors, as a regional combatant commander where you're working very closely with elements of the State Department and the ambassadors on the ground in each country, and then obviously as a CIA director, and even since in the business world, where I've traveled to some 40 countries or so over the course of the last 4 years for that and for academic endeavors. Indeed, it's what I'm doing here in Germany at an international security conference right now.
Did President-elect Trump ask you if you voted for him?
I don't vote, so that's an easy answer. And I also did not support him, nor did I oppose him, nor did I support or oppose any other candidate. I've truly tried to be apolitical, non-political, George, as I think you know, and so that was a pretty easy question to answer.
General Petraeus, thanks for joining us this morning.